and welcome to the start of week 2 at Troy University. I'd like to take a few moments to go through a few things with you so that you can see the areas in which you can continue to focus and concentrate on. And then, of course, to kind of go over what you guys discussed for week 1. Just to start, if you have any questions as far as what we're going to be doing for the next week, the best place to look is under assignments. If you look under week 2, you will see that this week we're going to focus on mainstream realism and African American realism, as last week we focused on basic realism and local color. You will also notice under that area that the readings are there. The readings are in this book, which is the Norton Anthology of American Literature, 1865 to 1914, and it's volume C. The readings for this week are James, The Art of Realism on page 908, and then African American Realism we'll be reading Chestnuts, The Passing of Grandison on 714, Paul Laurence Dunbar, Lyrics of a Lowly Life on page 1028, and Joel Chandler Harris from the Uncle Remus stories, which you probably have already read from last week, so this will be kind of a recap. But instead of what we focused on last week, just in general with realism and local color, this time you're going to be focusing on some of the tenets of African American realism. As you guys are getting comfortable with, you will see that the discussion board does have the information to kind of use as a frame. In mainstream realism and African American realism, we will be sticking with this idea of the faithful representation of reality. We'll also be looking at the idea of determinism and also the lower classes and the notion of naturalism that will be coming up. We will also have a few observations based on the idea that, and we will be building on African American realism throughout the period, but we'll also be talking about the idea that the Civil War and slavery directly affected the literature that we'll be reading. Now, as I was going through your week 1s, I try to pick up on things that I think are important for you to consider. And all of you made some very valuable commentary on the readings and or on the discussion areas. So I really do applaud you for really digging into the literature. I know that, as some of you have mentioned, that reading is not, or reading these texts has not always been what you find to be enjoyable, but you are all kind of focusing on making it enjoyable. So I'd like to kind of first start out with kind of chronological. Christopher M. mentioned in the very beginning that the story by Ambrose Bierce, Chickamauga, really pulled out some ideas that we can see happening in contemporary society in relation to post-traumatic stress disorder. And this is key, and as you can see as we build on these ideas of realism, that this is something that's going to come up again and again and again on the idea of war and war's effects. Ansley mentioned once she really enjoyed seeing Mrs. Ansley's triumph in Roman fever because of her name, but also that she enjoyed that story in that it had a bit of humor to it. Charlene also mentioned that realism was something that she saw as operating as a conduit to see the personalities of the characters really shine through and to kind of give that fully rounded situation. Sarah S. mentioned that local color and the tenets of local color realism were very evident in both the stories of Hart and stories by Crane. Megan mentioned and added that notion of realism, which does deal with morality, that she saw a lot of the moral dilemmas operating in Wharton's Roman fever, which is true. The text really does kind of do this very interior debate on right and wrong, and also perceptions versus reality. Kevin mentioned Hal, which was good to see Hal being mentioned, that he saw one of the important tenets that Howells also mentioned was that realism really does implant these stories into real life and vice versa, that you kind of can see these events happening outside or off the page. Forrest mentioned that realism in fiction contains truth, that it's not just a made-up story. And that writing, and this is from Forrest, should contain the essence of human experience, which is a great way to kind of capture or to highlight the notion that realism doesn't happen outside the confines of reality, but it happens within the confines and, of course, the page. Jessica mentioned, kind of a feeling of why did I read this, particularly with the emotions that she felt were being brought to the surface from Bierce's Chickamauga and the small boy. Melvin mentioned that he kind of focused on the idea that there was a great conflict and layers of conflict between Brer Fox and Brer Rabbit. And he also really liked Chopin's The Storm, as it really highlighted some of the elements of local color realism for him. And I would agree that Catherine Chopin's work is very indicative of her time and also indicative of her geographic location. John O'Brien mentioned, and I think this is important, especially as we go into African American literature, that there are very overt racial views being expressed in both Bierce and in Harris, and they're not always the most flattering. I think we need to be aware that sometimes we're reading things that are not always going to be as contemporarily minded as we might see ourselves as, but we need to ask ourselves, what does this text say about this time period, and how does this text function in light of what we know and how we read and how we engage it? Lindsay mentioned that she really did enjoy the Joel Chandler Harris stories, and many of you did mention that these reminded you of your childhood or that you were very familiar with them. Jordan focused on Wharton's idea of fate, and she mentioned that in Roman Fever that fate was one's self-control, which is a great way to kind of picture the idea of willpower or freedom of action and also self-control. Christopher mentioned that the definition of realism and local color realism, he kind of really put it out there, and he focused on the idea of power. That power in realism as a whole really did situate in the truth teller, where with power in the idea of local color, that these were more fringe characters or peripheral characters. They didn't have the same power or the same ability to make change or to operate as agents of change. Miranda mentioned that Chickamauga was so powerful for her because it captured this imagination and it also captured this childlike innocence. Ryan also in his posting focused on the idea that in some of these stories the character was better or more developed than the plot, and also that the idea that in regionalism and especially with the dialects, that these were a little more difficult to engage or to interpret. And I do agree with that. I would recommend maybe reading them aloud. Sometimes that does have a tendency to make them a little clearer. Edmund mentioned also that the dialect was hard. Jonathan mentioned that the idea that these did reach their target audiences, that this realism in war literature was something that he could focus on. And he also mentioned that he liked it because of the connection to Tennessee. Roderick mentioned that there was a nice, in his posting, I would urge you to take a look at it, there's a nice comparison between realism and local color. In particularly, he focuses on the differences between Wharton's Roman Fever and Chopin's The Storm, which are a good way to kind of see the operation of realism and local color. Charles mentioned the notion that details really do bring you into the story in a great amount of detail and with a great amount of purpose. Joseph really focused on the idea that these authors allowed us a glimmer into characters' lives, but they also showed us a focus on the responsibility of the characters. Jeremy F. really focused on the notion that realism is about witnessing and about paying attention and retelling this or recasting it as a witness. Mark, like many of you, mentioned that the diction could be odd and was in many ways terribly hard to read. And I do, like I said, I can see that, but I think it's a very important lesson, particularly in local color realism and also as we continue on into African American realism, to realize that the way we say things is just as important as how we say it or what we say. Ashland focused on the idea that realism and war and gore was something that was very visceral and allowed a kind of connection with the subject matter and the story. Jason S. highlighted the idea that these readings, for the most part, were fairly enjoyable, and many of you did express a shock, or at least a little bit of surprise at the fact that these were not atrocious readings. Juan mentioned that these stories all captured or highlighted the ability of the senses, or the power of the senses, to both see and hear and to be absorbed into the story. Jennifer focused on the idea that realism is simply what makes a story real to the reader, and so it really does come down to the responsibility of the reader. And we'll talk about M.H. Abrams' idea that there's four major areas of text when we come to it. One, of course, is the writer. One, of course, is the text and the contents. The other is, of course, the world as we know it in culture. And then the fourth one is, of course, the reader and what we bring to it and what we don't bring to it. Camelia mentioned the idea that the characters in these local color stories were particularly well drawn. And we also had Emily kind of focusing on in a similar fashion to the timelessness, or the idea that these stories could be happening right now, that there's a certain quality of humanity throughout them. Carrie mentioned the connection of the author biography to the story, and that, as I just mentioned with Abrams, does have a tendency to happen. Sometimes we hear the biography of the author and we can see how he or she has pulled these elements into their story. Vance also mentioned that these were very easy to visualize, that the details and setting were very well crafted and put forward. And Quanisha mentioned also that focus on visualization. So I think, overall, from what I can see, the notes that I made in your observations, that you are truly hitting on the concepts and the categories that we need to hit on in relation to these stories. I do want you to keep in your head as you're going forward that the term realism is quite complicated in many ways. There are other realists. There are many different perspectives on it, so I don't want you to get married to just one option. And I really want you to think about, what is troubling about this reading? What is easy? What are my reactions to it? And how do I connect it within my understanding of what it means to be a text, of what it means for a reader to engage this? And to really kind of have some fun with that, because at the end of the day, these texts, while yes, they live stuck in the pages of a book, they do also come out into this realm where we discuss them and we engage them, and they become something more than simply words on a page. So I encourage you to have fun with the next set of readings, and please keep posting and responding and making sure that you are using evidence from the stories and the poems to support your observations in your postings. So if you say and you make a claim that realism is great because it captures the settings well, for instance, in the story by XYZ, this happens. So make sure you do pull that evidence in. If you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to contact me.